I want to welcome you to today's ODI's event. Our topic today is improving local governance and the service delivery, shouting at the system won't make it work. As well as those who here in London, we have several other online viewers watching from around the world. I look forward to receiving your questions later. Let me introduce myself. My name's Andrew Mush. I work with Mzumbe University as a lecturer. Mzumbe University is in Tanzania. My background is in an NGO. I grew up in NGO. I worked with NGOs. Last time I was with Tanzania Association of Non-Governmental Organizations, and later I went to do my PhD, and my focus was more on NGO and the activism in Tanzania. After my PhD, I joined Mzumbe University as a lecturer, and mostly I teach courses in governance and the civil societies at the master's and undergraduate level. And also I'm part of the team of which we have this project on improving local governance and service delivery, of which we are trying to develop a performance index for local governances in Tanzania. So our today's focus is really we're trying to see the whole question of accountability and to see the gap between what the theories and the practice, the gap between theory and the practice. And even our project is more focused on that aspect of trying to see the gap between theory and the practice. So we are going to try to answer and focus our discussion around that topic. Where I have together with a panel of 5 experts. On my right-hand side, next to me is Anam Day, who is with Leeds University, also is an ODI associate. Anam Day is a development anthropologist with more than 20 years of experience in researching, writing, and teaching on development policy. Her research focuses on local governance, community-driven development, livelihoods, and the effectiveness and the service delivery. Next to her, we have Patricia Shomba. Patricia is an independent researcher with significant experience in researching, writing, and training on development policy and the practice at international and the national level. Our research focuses on local governance, poverty alleviation, illegal migration, and the gender issues. And on my left-hand side, I have Ananliankia. At the moment, she's in her final stages of writing a PhD at the University of Bradford. And before that, she used to work with media in Tanzania, and her last assignment was with Tanzania Women Association. That's TAMWA. That's a media association for journalists, women journalists in Tanzania. Ananlia is the experienced journalist who has covered the issues of development, gender, and politics in Tanzania. Her research focuses on how traditional media shape debates on development. Another expert panelist is Tim Kelsall. She is seated towards the end of my right-hand side. Tim is with ODI on politics and the governance team. Tim specializes in political economy analysis and political anthropology. And he has interests in governance, democracy, transitional justice, economic growth, education, and health. He has worked in several developing countries, including Tanzania, Sierra Leone, and Cambodia. And lastly, I have Helen Mills. She's worked with the Intrac. She's a chief executive. She just recently joined the organization. Helen comes to Intrac from Uganda, where she has been leading the implementation of the civil society She's leading the implementation of the civil society-focused holistic governance facility that DGF shares a wide-ranging background in international development, both overseas and in London, with UK's Department for International Development, in individual consultants as well as in the private sector. Helen has also worked with public sector policymakers and civil society practitioners in a variety of leadership roles to advance social change in other parts of Africa and Asia. I would like to start to engage my team by asking Anna and Patricia. I want to ask them to educate us on the following issues. What are the highlights and the key issue and the key takeaways of a 3-year DFID SRC funded project that aimed at creating a local governance index in Tanzania? Please, Anna and Patricia, take over.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. I mean, the sort of overall focus of the event this morning is around this idea of how can we make local governance work better? How can we get better service delivery, and particularly service delivery that is accessible to and impacts on the very poorest, so that we have more equitable and inclusive social services. And we started off on a 3-year research project, really exploring this problem. How do you get better service delivery? How do you improve local governance in order to drive service delivery that is inclusive, but also to just drive improvements in service delivery more generally? The research started off, like these ESRC DFID projects, they evolve over a number of years. So the original thinking for the project goes back to 2011, 2012. And that was a time when indexes are all the rage. And we have things like the Mo Ibrahim Governance Index being seen as having great potential in terms of driving conversations around governance. And so this particular research proposal came out of a conversation in Tanzania with the then director of the Foundation for Civil Society, who said, well, we have these governance indexes at the national level and the international level. Couldn't we make one for the local government level, so that when I'm working with civil society, they have some sort of tool that says, how is local government doing? A mechanism by which to engage local government on their performance. And so the project started from that idea. It then takes quite a long time to go from proposal to getting the funds in place and delivering a project like this. And this is a research project that was essentially asking the question then, can we create a local governance performance index in Tanzania? What are the politics of doing that? What are the dynamics of doing that? How would we implement it? So it's not a consultancy project in the sense that we didn't set out to design and implement a local governance index. And that was particularly one of the comments we had back from the reviewers of this as a research project, saying, don't make this a consultancy project, this is a research project about the process of trying to do that. So when we talk about the research, and when you read about the sort of outputs of the project, it's very much in that tone. We're not trying to create a manual for how to do a local governance performance index. We're talking about what is that space for trying to create a local governance performance index, how possible is it to get there, and what are the sort of essential questions, bottlenecks and things that we find as we go. So because the time is quite short, I'll go directly to the project then. So over the last 3 years, we've been working as a team. Now, I started off within Mzumbe University on this project and have since moved ODI and now University of Leeds. But we're a team of Mzumbe University leading the project with the Foundation for Civil Society in Tanzania, with Intrac, and later then with ODI and the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network. The project starts with trying to map the space. So we have this diagram here that really comes out of the first phase of the project. We were working in 2 different districts of Tanzania, an urban area in the far west of the country and a more rural area in Vomero district, to try and say, how does the governance system in Tanzania work in theory and how does it actually work in practice? And so what we've done is map out how the system is. You can see it goes from the national level down to the village level. If we can just go down to the village level. We started at the village level and we took 4 villages in each place. And now, if you want to know about the methodology, I think it's best to have that conversation later or go to our documents. But through wide range of interviewing at the village level. We mapped the system, how things actually happened, who was responsible for what in the system. Because if we're going to hold local government to account, which bit of local government are we holding to account, and what are we holding them to account for? So when we start to map out the system, we find a very big gap in the Tanzanian context between the system in theory and what actually happens in practice. So how does change happen in practice is many multiple routes very often from the village level, where villages are trying to negotiate many different actors, local government being one of them, but also we have, if we go up the system, the remains of the one-party system in the district and regional commissioners. We have extremely influential faith-based organisations, which are service delivery organisations as well, and civil society organisations. So we have a very complex governance setup. And so if we're going to say what are lines of accountability, who are we holding to account, it's very hard to do that in a system where we have multiple lines of accountability. What we also found was in our interviewing throughout the system, so we interviewed and did fieldwork from the village level up, through the ward level, through the district level, if we could go up the slide please, right up to the national level, and that was enabling us to track the different lines of accountability. What we also found was different lines of blame through the system. So the district would blame the central government, but also they'd blame the villagers for not delivering on policies. The villagers would blame each other very often. It's our fault we haven't delivered development. They would also blame the district. They would blame the ward councillors. So there were many, many lines of blame, and it was very, very opaque as to who should even be held to account. The decentralisation system of the government actually is designed to push blame to the villagers. If services aren't delivered, it's actually the villagers who are at fault. So village councils, if we go right back down, have a huge list of responsibilities for delivery. I find it's just quite personal since my father-in-law is a village chairman, so we often discuss all these issues that the village have to deliver without resources and, as a voluntary job, essentially. I'm going to move on quite quickly because time is very short. So what we did from looking at these lines of blame and lines of accountability was say, well, what indicators could we actually use to say something about service delivery in a way that encompasses the difficulties at all of these different levels and captures some of these multiple levels? So in a very iterative, repeated process of going back to the villages, going back to the districts, going back to the wards, we've come up with a list of indicators, and you have a one-page of the various indicators. Now, these are generated out of an iterative process, which Patricia is going to talk about in a moment. What we've now done is collect a baseline of these indicators. There are gaps in the indicators, but what we're saying is that this local governance index can be used, and we found great receptiveness to it at the local level, but as a problem-solving tool, not as a judgment tool of how good is your local government, but as a tool to start the conversations between the different actors at the different levels. So, for instance, in one area where you have a lot of land disputes, we can focus in on the land disputes and try and look at that as a problem-solving area. So the point is that it's not about the shouting at the system, but trying to understand where the blockages are in the system and how we can work around those. And I'll pass on to Patricia, who's been directly involved in creating the final set of indicators and collecting the baseline data.
Thank you, Ada. So there is so much to say, so I'm just trying to figure out how to put it in a very easy way. Well, what we did after phase one, after we collected and the first set of information, we went to the people to ask them about what they think about the service delivery, and they given us their opinion on what they were not happy with. So we put them together and came out with what Anna just talked about. Then we went back to them again as we did some focus groups with the citizen, with the local government, which is like councillors. We didn't manage to talk to the MPs, but we talked to the councillors and we talked to the civil society as well. We presented to them these indicators for them to tell us what they think. So we went through the process where we ask them to tell us if we had this, will it make any difference in terms of what they do in their everyday life? Will it make any difference for the citizen and for the councillor? Would they use it if it was made available to them? And they all say that it was useful to have something like that because, like Anna said, we start the discussion. So it's not about trying to blame one part for not doing something because we already know there is a lot of blame going on around there, like the government blaming citizens, citizens blaming the government. So it wasn't about that. It's just about if we have to start that conversation, do you think these indicators will help you? So they gave their opinion, which most of them were quite positive, and they did tell us what they think that didn't make sense to them, because when we did the first phase, the civil society came out with some ideas like gender and roads. So I left it. When we went back to do the workshop, then I asked them, do you think we should have something that is related to gender and roads? And it didn't make sense to them. So because we asked them to tell us what they think, not us telling them what we should have on the indicators. So based on that, we removed most of the indicators that we thought didn't make sense to our stakeholders. So from there, then we come up with, it's not a set of indicators, a bit more refined than the one that we had before. And then we went out to test it. So we went to the same villages again to collect data on it. And that's what we are working on now. So yeah, I'm running out of time. So I was just going to finish off to say that it was a very positive and participatory experience that, for me, the take on is that citizens did really like the idea that we went back to them to give them feedback 2 years later to what we did, like when we went on phase 1 to ask them questions. They were quite happy that we came back to give them feedback on the outcome. So we hope that this will continue in the future. So if you need more, we can talk more after. Thank you
very much, Anna and Patricia. If the audience have any questions about this project, please keep them. We'll let you do that later. Now I want to invite Analea Inkia to share our experience from media point of view. Analea, in light of what Anna and Patricia have just presented, what would be the role of media in holding governance to account for development? Please.
Thank you.
Share your experience.
Maybe I start off by saying, looking into the media from the historical perspective, there are researchers who have done a lot of work in terms of what media can do to improve development, particularly in developing countries. From 1964, Schramm actually did a very huge kind of research and proved that media can play a very crucial role in development. But also when you look into what UNESCO says about the normative role of the media has a very specific role to ensure that government is transparent and accountable to the people. And in Tanzania, when they actually kind of put up a law on local government, it actually stipulated plainly that there's a need for people participation in local government projects. So it's up to whoever is doing any project to involve the media. So there is that theoretical perspective. But also another point I want to make is that is the historical perspective of the media. In Tanzania media of today has its history. Tanzania was colonized, as you know, and the media had a role. And that role, for example, in the past, the media would actually engage with the government. A lot of views of development, it was from the government perspective. And today, if you look into the media of today is not very different. It does not engage the majority citizens in terms of hearing what they are saying. So development from Tanzania, from the media perspective, is from the ruling class, from the people at the top, not much from the grassroots level. If you could show the slide I had put on, please, to show the research I've done. For example, if you look into this research, I examined more than 10,000 news stories. And if you look into the voices, 57% of those 10,000 stories were from the government perspective. And when I talk of government perspective, I mean the government, the donors, the united bodies, and the like. Government from the top level to the bottom level. And if you look at the other group is like civil society organizations, and little from the citizen, 10%. Those were the citizens. So very little is heard from the people. And then if you look into the media also, you find that a lot of the stories are urban-oriented. And the majority of them, nearly 50% of the stories which I examined, were from Dar es Salaam. It's like Dar es Salaam is one country, and the out country is another country, if you look into that. So this is how the media is reflecting development. So when it comes to the grassroots level, at the local government level, very little is actually coming out into the media. That is how it is. And when it comes to now men and women, only 18% of the voices in the media are women. 82% are men. Yet 51% of the population are women. So what kind of development media is reflecting? This is the question which is down there. And but we are saying why it matters for the media to engage with news on the local government level. For the local government level to be able to deliver services, there must be a citizen participation in planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of projects. But what is the reality? And then there must be efficiency. Efficiency in the sense that for the local government to be able to be efficient, it must have human resource, it must have capital. But does the media report on this? And then there must be efficiency in terms of delivery of service, so that people are able to enjoy this kind of services which are being delivered by the local government official. But most critical one, the transparency. The local government should be transparent in terms of what actually is happening, what kind of activities they have, what kind of problem they have at the local government level. But when you look into how the media engage, can I have another slide, please? How the media engage. We have said that if you look into this diagram, we find that the issues which are raised by the citizens, their majority in terms of schooling, in terms of water, in terms of road, 59% of the stories were raising those issues: water problem, schooling problem, electricity problem, road problem, and the rest. They'll form majority of the news in the newspapers, in the radio, and whatever. But now when it comes to the stories which are given priority in terms of on the front page, which becomes a lead story, which everybody will be listening to, what is the story of the day? It's not, these stories are not there. There are trivial issues spoken by the politicians. Those are the majority. Look at that, 57%. When it comes to the major stories, 18% were political stories, isn't it? But when it comes to headlines, the stories which are given, which matters in the news, they are 57%. Okay? So we are asking if the issues of Ananchi are the majority in the news, but when it comes to what issues to be taken on board, is those issues spoken by the politicians. That is a critical problem. We are saying why this is happening. When you look at why it is happening, is that we have laws which are actually kind of limiting the media. But again, the capacity of the media. It is only recently journalism schools have been opened to the university level. So we have critical problem in terms of capacity of journalists in Tanzania. But the most critical one is that people who are implementing projects, they are not engaging the media. They are doing it by themselves. So when media comes to actually engaging into that, they'll engage into who is opening who's actually giving the money into the project, finish. But how that money is used, how is it trickling down to the people? Nobody reports that. So that's how we have that serious problem. I don't know whether I finished or not.
Yeah, you are done. Thank you.
Thank you.
I know time is. You would like to say more, but time
Sorry.
is not on your
Sorry.
side. Okay, thank you, Ananlea. Now I want to invite Tim to tell us a story about how do politics and the power influence local governance and safety deliveries. Please take over.
Yeah, I have a slide that I'm going to talk you through. So how do politics and power influence local service delivery? This slide here is my representation of what some people will know as the World Development Report 2004 Accountability Triangle. And this triangle has been, is that on? This triangle has been very influential in shaping how donors and governments think about local service delivery. And the basic idea is that your service recipients, this is your citizens, are the principals who provide goals for your politicians or policymakers who are their agents. And what is supposed to happen is that these people transmit their desires through what's called the long route of accountability to politicians, who then transmit them down through the civil service to frontline service providers, who then provide services. Okay? So if this structure is not working very well, there are various things that governments and development agencies have tried to do. One of them is to try and strengthen the long route of accountability. And one way of doing this is by trying to strengthen the democratic process. So it could be, civic education, election strengthening, parliamentary strengthening. Another way is to strengthen this route through the civil service. So been a variety of public sector reform programs which attempt to make civil service managers more accountable to politicians. And then there's another way of doing it, which is called the short route of accountability, which is sometimes called client power. And one way of doing this is actually to kind of enhance the short route via local government decentralization. And another way is to try and empower citizens by means of things like school committees, local health committees, citizen scorecards, various ways of pumping information into the system about service delivery so that service recipients can hold the service providers more accountable. Okay, so let me move on to another slide. However, there's a problem with this kind of understanding of how the system works, because very often these links in the accountability chain get broken. You can see where I've got red figures that suggest a break in the chain. One way in which that chain may be broken is if politicians don't compete for votes on the basis of providing good services to the general population. Instead, they compete on the basis of clients list appeals. So through certain individuals in the civil service and at the service front line, they promise to deliver goods to private individuals or only certain groups of citizens. So they give preferential treatment rather than serving the public as a whole. And the citizenry doesn't act as a collective because it thinks, okay, we'll trust this guy because he knows these guys and they'll give preferential treatment to our ethnic group or our religious group or our village or whatever it may be. Okay. Another reason why this accountability triangle is a little too simplistic is because it often underestimates the extent of interagency coordination failures. So, for instance, you might have a plan to, deliver new textbooks to schools, okay? But the problem is that the people who are producing the textbook are reliant on money coming from the Ministry of Finance. And the Ministry of Finance may not be talking to the people who are supposed to be producing the textbooks. even if you can get those two things to work together, actually getting those textbooks to do any good in the classroom may involve teachers being trained in how to use the textbooks. But sometimes, again, there's no coordination between the different departments that are responsible for these different tasks. And if you're down here at the level of the citizen, it's not clear that you know what's going on up here and that you know the nature of these coordination failures. So it's very difficult for you to actually impact on that. So, okay, can I have the next slide? And then things can get even more complicated because often you'll find that the civil service is kind of splintered by various professional associations that may have an interest in blocking reforms. Frontline service providers may belong to public sector unions, which have their own ideas about how things should be done. Citizens themselves may be divided by class, ethnicity, gender, and they may face simple sort of free rider problems. So there are all kinds of obstacles to getting citizens to act collectively in pursuit of their interests in service provision. And then the next slide, please. And then, so you have all that complexity, and you add on the top private sector actors, development partners, NGOs, as Anna mentioned, faith-based organizations, and you see that what you have is a very, very complex social and political field. So most sort of donor programs that have sought to strengthen service provision by means of these voice and accountability programs or public sector reform programs in a fairly sort of linear and blueprint fashion have usually been unable to cope with the complexity of this social field. So they've been unable to kind of join up the different links, the different hypothetical links in the accountability chain. And I think that remains a big problem in service provision. And I think that Anna's research and the kinds of things that citizens and district officials told them at local level actually bear that out. Okay, so that's...
Okay, thanks a lot, Tim. Now I want to invite Helen, newly appointed CEO of Interact, to just share from our perspective, how can donor-funded interventions best support improvements in local governance and service delivery? Please.
Thank you, Andrew. I just want to pick up on what Tim has been explaining in terms of the long route and the short route, and to give a glib answer about sort of how donors might support the improvement of local governance and service delivery. And that's by making the links between the two. Less compartmentalisation of programming, more flexible resourcing to allow for the links that are in practice there, but in theory are not don't always find their way into programming. So you get this sort of distinction between the demand side accountability work with the supply side public sector reform programs, and the two don't always speak to each other. You also get, when you're looking at local governance, a set of challenges around the institutions and the formal organisation of government, but not necessarily with a focus on why government exists in terms of its service delivery perspectives, service provision perspectives, I should say, because also there's an assumption in a lot of development programs that service delivery is by government, but in the reality in Tanzania and in the Uganda where I've just come from, it's also a lot of private actors, faith-based organisations who are out there and providing services and filling the gap where the system doesn't work. So less compartmentalisation of programs will be my sort of first suggestion as how donors might engage differently. I think, again, understanding the complexity has been described, but the barriers to inclusive service delivery are political and institutional. And very often some of the technical programming that goes on is blind to the politics, political reality, the elite capture within the systems, the weak state capacity and why that exists, the whole question of skewed incentives of frontline workers who are in these multiple systems with competing demands and are there by virtue of patronage or other informal systems of governance. So I think understanding and working with the incentives to try and change the incentives to actually turn this sort of downward spiral into a vicious circle into a virtuous circle of delivery for citizens. On the issue of political incentives, I think it's quite important. I think Tim touched on the question of information and pumping information to the local citizenry so that they're informed and better understand what's going on. But there's a whole discourse about the politics of information sharing, the openness and transparency, and who gets to see what and learns what, and how information is used politically to the advantage both of the ruling parties and opposition parties in the political and the long route of accountability. So just being aware of that and framing programmes with that knowledge in mind, understanding the political context and what is driving what looks, to be simple things that looked at from the outside, simple things to fix, but obviously are there for a whole range of complex political reasons. My fourth point would be to be in it for the long haul. I think way back when there was the Paris Declaration and the Accra principles about putting support to governments in the long term, predictable funding in practice, and being able to support these very complex social accountability programs, making sure that there is funding available. I mean, I think in Uganda, the sort of the money that eventually trickles down through the system is so limited to be meaningless. So even having a government official get out to a village, there's no money in for petrol to do that. So elaborate systems of accountability that demand even the officials to get to services, let alone the politicians, etc., is limited. But if there was predictable and multi-year funding, I mean, a lot of the funding comes in forms of grants. The organisation I was working with had very short-term grants to civil society organisations who face this constant battle to stay afloat before they can do anything meaningful within their communities. And then finally, I would say having realistic expectations. And I speak from experience of having 8 donors supporting the civil society, the democratic governance facility, and a need to have accountability to those donors in terms of the funding that was provided to the programme to civil society organisations in Uganda, but an expectation that small amounts of money could change the world. And I think we had a log frame that demanded that we were going to make there would be a sort of a theory of change that took us into improving the rule of law and changing the economic situation in the country while we were providing very small-scale grants to small organisations working in a few villages. So I think having realistic expectations and not being hidebound by unrealistic accountability structures for the donors would be good. Also recognising that it's institutionally, it takes a long time to change these systems. UK government reform has been ongoing, to my knowledge, since 1980s. There's been an ongoing public service reform programmes and it's still evolving. These things take time. So if donors could plan in that way and be committed for the long term, I think that would be good.
Thank you, Helen. On behalf of the audience, I promise you that we will have realistic expectations from this from this meeting and the other events. Thank you. Now, I want to open for discussion. To open this, it's time for discussion. But before I do that, let me have a few questions for the panel. One, to Anna and Leah. The media, I understand that the media environment in Tanzania is said to be quite politically sensitive. What is your perspective on this, and how will this affect the role of media in the process of governance and accountability? That's an Leah. To Tim.
If Anna answers that one first, I think.
No, I'll ask the questions to the
okay.
person, then everybody will come back to that. And the Tim, my question to you is, what would be a politically realistic approach to seek improvement in governance and accountability at the local level? And to Anna and Patricia, your project has so far been tested and applied to specific tourists in Tanzania. How are these applicable to other contexts, situations, countries, and what will be the next step of this project? And finally, to Ellen and to all, are there any good examples of context in this, of which local governance and service delivery has been improved? What has driven this change? Please, let's start with Anna, then Tim.
Thank you very much. I know that the government of President Magufuli is doing a very good job in terms of fighting corruption in terms of making the government officials work. That is very good. However, there's a lot to be done in terms of, because development needs a lot of alternative voice from the people, voice from politicians, voice from civil society organizations, voice from across. And that voice can only be heard through the media. But when we actually curtail the power of the media, that is like denying people to contribute into development. So I would think there's a lot need to be done to open the alternative voice to be heard. But another point I would like to make is that the development actors, they need to do all they could do to ensure that they engage media throughout the project, for the media to be critical. Because for people to be able to hold the government into account, they have to have facts-based information, whether bad information or good information. When people have all those kind of information, they are able to take action. But if we hide information, for example, this kind of findings, they have to go back to the people, to the villages, to the districts, for people to know what is happening on the ground. When people know this, then they can take action. So, and I was thinking of using the local media, because local media are close to the people, and the people can really get out and speak about that. So, and I was thinking also media can be effective and critical and constructive if they have knowledge. The media in Tanzania, I'm sure, they are antagonizing with the government simply because they don't have a lot of information. Researchers keep information with themselves. Government keep information with themselves. So the media have nothing to say. They end up doing trivial, kind of publishing trivial news, interviewing politicians just for them to sell. Why? Because the real information that matters for development is with the researchers, is with the local government, is with whoever hold them. They make it secret. How can you make development secret? This is the problem we are having in Tanzania, and it's from colonial perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, I have some more slides. And, and do I need the mic again? Or? Okay, thanks. So what would be a politically realistic approach to strengthening accountability at the local level? Okay, I don't think that you strengthen accountability at a local level by strengthening formal institutions. And I don't think you do it just by putting more information about service delivery into the system, although that information may be a useful input. I think that accountability gets strengthened when ordinary people gain practical experience of solving problems and of holding, part of which may involve holding leaders to account, and which generates new habits of interacting with service providers and those people higher up the chain. So here's another diagram. So you begin, I think, with a very specific entry point, a very specific problem that can focus people's attention. So, I mean, for instance, we know that in many developing countries there's a problem of deploying teachers to remote areas to teach, actually. And we also know that often this can be caused by the fact that teachers don't want to go to these places because they're inhospitable, because they can earn more money in town, and often they avoid being deployed by sometimes bribing officials who turn a blind eye to the fact that they're not actually in post, that they're staying in town. And sometimes attempts to reform this system get blocked by powerful teacher unions who would rather preserve the status quo. So that's an example of how, a problem in development persists, because you have these people coloured in, these stakeholders coloured in red, who are opposed to any reform of the system, basically blocking change. And the people who might want change, like reform-minded officials or education NGOs, the private sector, or parents themselves, these people are kind of not joined up. They're not powerful enough to overcome this coalition. And you have a bunch of other people, maybe the president, the education minister, the treasury, even school children, even the media, who are kind of ambivalent about this problem, okay? I mean, they know it exists, but it's not at the top of their agendas. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So one thing that we can try to encourage as development practitioners in the first instance, I think, is by trying to link up some of these people that actually have an interest in reform so that they can act together. And in acting together, they may also be able to bring other more powerful actors on side. So in this diagram, you see that private sector education NGOs and reform-minded officials are now linked together. And they've also been able to shift the president from an ambivalent position to a pro-reform position. So now this becomes an issue that may be receiving some serious attention from the top of the system. Okay, can I have the next slide? And then as the coalition grows, you find that it's able to turn more of these ambivalent actors into pro-reform actors, and then to be able to isolate some of the stakeholders that are opposed to reform. And it may do this by, imposing sanctions on them. It may do this by, addressing some of the genuine concerns that those stakeholders may have. So, it may be about, improving living conditions for teachers in remote areas, as well as sanctioning them for not actually turning up in those areas. So in time, you're able to isolate reform opponents and actually gain some traction on this issue by breaking apart this anti-reform coalition. So I think that this is the way of actually increasing accountability for local service provision. And I believe that actors, as they gain experience of forming collectives or action groups to work around specific issues, I believe that then the habit of holding leaders to account will grow. So this involves sort of crossing this state-citizen divide. It's not simply citizens holding leaders to account, it's reform-minded groups and individuals acting together to solve specific problems. So that's my take on this subject.
Anandi, Patricia, please. 1 minute. Yeah.
If it's okay, I'll take this. Okay, I think it's really good that Tim has just come before that, because I think that illustrates a lot of the challenge that we have in Tanzania, but also the opportunity in taking our particular research forwards. I wouldn't want to rush to scale up this type of project, and very much with echoing what Helen said about taking time to embed this sort of research. This index is not for external use. It only has value if it's a value in those districts, and we have some commitments from those districts. For example, the mayor of Kigoma Ujiji is very keen to take this on, and that's how it will succeed, by being taken on in those local contexts and adapted for need, and actually being a tool within what Tim's describing as enabling some of the conversations to happen that could start some of those coalitions to come together around particular issues. And that might start to break down some of what we saw in the system, which was civil society simply blaming government, government blaming other parts of government, and start to say, well, okay, let's problem solve. And we find, if we think of the literature, Matt Andrews, the problem-driven iterative adaptation sort of approach to doing development differently, which I know that some of us in this room are interested in and have worked around, looking for examples of positive deviance, for example, which means where do we find people who are already problem solving? And our data actually threw up a number of examples of really positive problem solving from at the village level, from the district level, where individuals within the system had found ways to make it work with some really quite creative solutions. So learning from what those particular individuals were doing, making them part of these growing coalitions. But that won't happen from outside. What I'm interested in this project is working directly with our partners such as Foundation for Civil Society, who are with us, with the universities in Tanzania. We mustn't forget about the academic institutions. Having worked within Mzumbe, it started off as an institute for training administrators and local government staff. It still does train a lot of local government staff, degrees, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and even up to PhD. So there's a critical role there in building the capacity and critical understanding of the individuals who are going to be coming through into the civil service as well. So we mustn't forget universities within those coalitions. So I think if Mzumbe Foundation for Civil Society can take this forward with the local government actors, how it scales up is sort of not up to us and not up to the project, but it will evolve. And as Anna says, taking also local media's capacity into account.
Yeah, Helen, 30 seconds, please, and then audience.
30 seconds. Okay, I've got numerous examples of where we've seen positive action by civil society in raising the accountability and improving service delivery. The one I'll cite, if I've only got 30 seconds, is the Civil Society Budget Advisory Group in Uganda, who are working on participatory planning and budgeting through their own sort of networks, working in consultation with civil society groups to surface the issues, to identify the problems, and to then reformulate and recast those as part of the national budget planning process and playing those into a dialogue with the Ministry of Finance. So drawing through the system the voices of those that are articulating their needs around service delivery and putting those into the national planning. I think in the last 3 years, they have had 80 of their proposals accepted and reflected in the national budget. So from that perspective, it's really been successful. And you asked me what some of the drivers for that might have been. And I think it's about mutual trust and respect between the civil society organisations and the Ministry of Finance, a willingness by government to actually buy into that idea of voice being fed into the system and seeing value in the input. So actually benefiting from the information that is arriving to them in a form that they can digest and translate into policy choices. And then having the networked organisation. So CSBAG is a coalition of civil society organisations that draws its sort of membership from across Uganda and is able to get different perspectives into that policy dialogue in that way.